This week, the main focus has been, of course, on the agreement between Israel and Hamas to phase the freeing of a set number of hostages in return for a temporary ceasefire and the release of a certain number of Palestinian prisoners. This is one of those remarkable moments where you have to note the capacity of human beings to focus on very specific stories in amongst the debris of countless other stories. Let's be clear, every hostage released who would otherwise have had a high chance of being killed is a overwhelming human positive. No reservations, no begrudging them whatever chance of survival and recovery they may have. And they will naturally take the attention for a while. The joy of some families who get their loved ones back, the stories they have to tell of what they've endured, all of that. Meanwhile, of course, sadly, large numbers of people on both sides have still been slaughtered, and soon it will start up all over again. What does Hamas get from this pause? Are they hoping for a respite for their people? Well, it's hard to think so, because they specifically hide behind those people, placing their command centres and tunnel networks deliberately in their vicinity so that they can point at their broken bodies in the event of an Israeli strike. Are they hoping to negotiate an end to the war? Well, heck no. Hamas leaders have reportedly repeated their pledge to carry out similar attacks to those on October the 7th again and again, if they get the chance. When you totally believe that if you get killed, you will die a martyr and you will go to heaven, you have little to lose. At least that's what Hamas leaders themselves have said in so many words about why they don't fear Israel's retribution. No, predominantly the deal strengthened Hamas by enabling it to catch its breath, to regroup, to restructure. Meanwhile, Israel citizens have to come to terms with the psychological double take, with negotiating with the organisation that just joyfully slaughtered over 1,000 of its people and can't wait to do it all over again. This just rather points to the fact that Hamas knew what it was doing when it took significant numbers of hostages, the enormous moral dilemma that would create for Israel. Within weeks of the horror, the hostages' families emerged as a powerful political force within Israel, making it worth the country's while enduring the cost of this pause in order to get some of those people back. It doesn't then go away, of course. Only some hostages will be released, a minority, in fact. Hamas still wants to destroy Israel. Israel still wants to destroy Hamas, and innocent people will still be in the way. At some point, Israel will only be able to achieve its goal by pressing on, knowing that it will likely mean the end of the remaining hostages still in captivity. And it will have to deal with how that plays out with the families within its own midst. Or it will have to accept that it is impossible to achieve that goal. A, because it probably de facto is impossible to do fully and completely anyway, and B, because the internal political consequences of the harm to hostages will just become too difficult to overcome. While the focus of attention, therefore, is distracted right now by those desperately worthy human stories, it's worth just remembering the moral compromise and the terrible choices to come. They're still there, hanging in the air, waiting for the point where they will be impossible to distract from for any longer. Meanwhile, dilemmas of a different sort present themselves pretty much wherever you look in the world. So, for example, following reports of hospitals in northern China being overwhelmed with sick children suffering from an undiagnosed respiratory illness. The World Health Organization has asked the Chinese government, is there anything we should know? On the wholly theoretical possibility that a novel pathogen could start in China and end up spreading to the rest of the world, I know, highly unlikely except for in the movies, but you've kind of got to ask. China has responded to that query to say that they have not detected any unusual or novel diseases, so that should be that. Of course, that's not entirely dissimilar to what they were saying in January 2020, up until the point where they weren't saying that anymore. That said, it has been noted that this is the first flu season since the lifting of China's zero-COVID policy, and the authorities' insistence that this is the natural circulation of common bacterial infections that affect younger children that had remained suppressed over the previous couple of years. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility. It's highly feasible, in fact. But, once bitten, twice shy. Given the lack of responsiveness on COVID, more timely and specific information is being requested. Right now, there's no indication that there's a global threat. As you might expect, people are keeping a careful eye on it, just to be sure. Well, half an eye on it anyway, while arguing about a whole host of other things, whatever's right in front of their faces. For instance, initiatives to remove or at least reduce the use of pesticides in the EU have received several major pushbacks during the last week. Most specifically, a central plank of the European Commission's Green Deal, the Sustainable Use Regulation, was killed off in a plenary vote at the European Parliament. It was the focus for significant disagreement, but it had been expected to scrape through that vote and then move on to the next stage, where the final text would be subject to negotiations with the member states, lots of finessing, and so on. But no, instead, MEPs rejected it outright, with 299 voting against, 207 for, 121 abstaining. The usual hyperbolic assessments were on hand from the various protagonists on both sides. For those dismayed at the loss of the bill, it was obviously a disaster. Austrian Green MEP Sarah Wiener, for instance, said, "This is a very dark day for society as a whole and for the environment, and also for farmers." The centre-right European People's Party, on the other hand, said the result was a sensational rejection of left-wing extremism. This shows that pesticide reduction needs to be done with farmers and not against them, they said. Both sides seemed to feel that they were on the side of farmers. By and large, the farmer organisations had pushed back against the legislation, or at least some of the detail of it, although mostly environmental groups blamed lobbying by the agrochemical industry specifically, which is no huge surprise, I suppose. My advice is always to take the hot takes with a pinch of salt. Campaigners are forever putting forward complex legislation on an issue, the details of which may be seriously controversial due to what may sometimes be unintended consequences, sometimes intended ones, or poorly thought through or drafted bills. But then if you oppose that poorly drafted bill, you're seen as being opposed to all the good things and the puppies that the bill promised, and aligned with bad things and the anti-puppies or something. Interestingly, the setback came soon after the European Commission announced that, much to the fury, again, of environmental activists, it would renew authorization for the use of weed killer glyphosate for the next decade. Now, glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world, familiar as a weed killer to gardeners and, more importantly, farmers everywhere. It's incredibly useful, it's low cost, and it works, which is why it's so much used. But environmentalists have been fighting against it for several decades, arguing that it's harmful to beneficial insects as well as to humans. In 2015, the World Health Organization stated that it was, quote, probably carcinogenic. Not a wholly robust and specific critique, you might think. And other agencies, such as the US Environmental Protection Agency and the European Chemical Agency, classified it as non-carcinogenic. In the event, there will be certain restrictions that remain, such as a ban on the use of the chemical to dry crops before harvest, which was something that some people did, and the need for certain measures to protect non-target organisms to reduce the unintended damage, in other words. This is one of those areas where highly motivated agencies on both sides have completely muddied the water. Robin Mesnage, a toxicologist at King's College London, told the journal Nature, "There are too many conflicting studies on the product, some of poor quality." And this is the thing. When you get a very specific target for campaigning like this, you can get politically minded researchers carrying out studies to damn the product with perhaps less than wholly objective rigour. And of course, you can get industry-funded studies on the other side that may have at least as much and probably more potential for bias. Mesnage added that if glyphosate were to be banned, the chemicals used to replace it would likely be not less toxic, but more so, and could increase the cost of food production. Needless to say, these two events together have added to this growing sense of a degree of backlash against environmental policies, particularly in the EU. Although it would be easy to overstate the degree to which that's the current reality across the board. It's certainly something of a mood music change, though. Something you might expect to be a topic for conversation next week, maybe. Why next week? Well, as you may know, the next annual Climate COP conference is due to get underway next week in the United Arab Emirates. COP28. I know, you can't wait. You may be aware that the UAE, home as it is to some pretty powerful fossil fuel vested interests, has been somewhat controversial with a number of COP attendees as the president for this year. No doubt all those people are laughing this week with the keen sense of irony and good humour for which they're famous, with the news that next year's summit may well be overseen by the United Arab Emirates, maybe even hosted again by them. Yes, that's right, next year's summit was supposed to be hosted somewhere in Eastern Europe, but it has been known for the last 6 months that Russia was intent on vetoing any specific suggestion of a EU member as being unacceptable to them. EU member Bulgaria had been in the frame, but apparently now that's not on. Armenia or Azerbaijan might have been feasible for Russia to agree, but each of them would veto it being the other. Well, here we are 6 months later and nothing has changed. What is Russia's rationale for vetoing EU countries? Not that it matters much, but what they say is that they don't believe, quote, that Bulgaria or any other EU country will be impartial in running COP29. Impartial, you say? In what way? To what end? Answer, doesn't really matter, don't worry about it, because the words have nothing to do with the real reason, which is simply retribution for the current state of geopolitics, where they are blocked by EU countries in relation to the Ukraine war. And let's face it, it's not as though Putin, whose regime basically relies on selling fossil fuels to that part of the world still willing to buy from him, cares a great deal about climate change. These things are normally done well in advance. We do know, for instance, that COP30, for one after the next one, will be in Brazil. The thing is that if the current conference presidency doesn't have someone to hand over to, then it remains in the hands of the current incumbent. The United Arab Emirates, which has had a lot more criticism than it enjoys over the current leg, It's not been champing at the bit to retain the presidency, although it hasn't wholly ruled it out. By all accounts, it really didn't want to physically host next year, although according to the Financial Times, it has recently put itself forward as being prepared to do so. Now, under the rules, the venue could revert to Bonn in Germany, which is where the UN climate body is headquartered, with the UAE would still be in charge of the process as president. Is this really the most important thing that all of those people could be arguing about? You might be wondering. Well, it's just a reminder once again that international politics is rarely constrained to the actual issues that are supposed to be on the table. Jostling for position, diplomacy through clenched teeth, these are almost as old as the human race itself. Now, if they do get around to focusing on the agenda, what actually will they be talking about? Key points of contention are the constant push from some to get stronger and more explicit commitments to phase out fossil fuel production as an alternative to the more gradual so-called phase down favoured by others. And the other, once again, will be all about money. Developing countries want wealthy nations of the world to pay them to change their processes and to adapt to climate change on the grounds that the wealth that they have was created on the back of those historical emissions that got us here in the first place. So those that didn't benefit directly from that wealth creation should now be supported in clearing it up. The wealthy nations have promised to pay a significant amount. Most of them are not delivering on even the promises they've made so far, which are considered to fall short in any case of what's needed. And so, naturally enough, there's going to be a row about it. Now, the United States did agree to a tentative deal for a new fund for climate-damaged countries quite recently, but only after watering it down so that the wealthy nations did not have a mandated responsibility to pay. You might wonder what the value is of such an agreement. Certainly some of the unwieldy attendee list of 70,000 people who are expected to attend no doubt will be. Expect plenty of apocalyptic coverage in the next few days, some symbolic agreements on different specific topics, but probably not much in significant change or breakthroughs on the big, most difficult issues. If you find it all getting a bit much, maybe you should consider volunteering to, advance human science. Elon Musk's brain science company Neuralink recently said that it's looking for volunteers for human trials on its brain implants. These are the would-be devices of the future, which might enable you to control your computer with the power of your mind and all sorts of other things in due course, which you probably never thought that you would ever need to do. All you have to do is let them drill a hole in your skull and implant the device onto the surface of your brain. Sounds easy. Are you tempted by that idea? What? Not even a little bit? Well, it's probably just as well, because things are not entirely without a certain amount of question. Although Neuralink has completed its testing phase with monkeys, reports have been leaking out that at least some of those monkeys didn't have such a great time. Apparently, around a dozen of them died in the process, including some from the effects of ruptured brains and drawn-out unpleasant deaths. Now, Elon Musk has previously said that this was nothing to worry about. All the monkeys that died were terminal cases that were close to death already, saying that none of them died as a result of a Neuralink implant. And that would be that, if it were true. But increasingly it's being alleged that it's not even remotely true. Wired magazine has reported a conversation with an ex-Neuralink employee who told them that Musk's claims were, quote, a straight-up fabrication. We had these monkeys for a year or so before any surgery was performed, he said. A separate scientist who'd worked at the primate centre said all the monkeys were young and likely healthy. Now, this rather matters. I mean, obviously it matters if you were one of the people who actually were considering volunteering to be amongst the first human guinea pigs for this bold new technology. But it matters even more than that in the wider context. If the stories about the bad experiences of the monkeys in the Neuralink trials turn out to be true, then not only would that be a massive blow to the viability of Neuralink's interface, but Elon Musk could be guilty of securities fraud for making false statements. The Securities and Exchange Commission is, we learned this week, being pressured to investigate Musk's statements versus the actual reality. Right now, reportedly, Neuralink is keeping calm and carrying on. Unlike its monkeys, allegedly. It is oiling its robots, the ones that will be conducting the brain implant surgery, into humans. Some people are distinctly alarmed at the potential for brain scanning technology generally, and would be only too happy if one of the high-profile leaders in this space ran into serious obstacles. How much can a private company learn about you from getting access to a significant readout of your brainwave activity? Well, by all accounts, quite a bit. Is the privacy of your private thoughts protected by the American Constitution, if you're American, or anything else if you're not? Probably not right now. No, because none of those existing rules were created in the knowledge that such a thing was even possible. So the obvious dilemmas haven't even been considered. Personally, I can't help but think that the state of the art in 5 or 10 years' time will probably have been set by the companies with products that don't require you to have an actual bolt in the brain. But maybe that's just a lack of entrepreneurial vision on my part. Right now, I have to say, I think I need a brain scanner like I need a, well, you know. I may not need a hole in the head, discuss, but this channel does need Patreon supporters in order to be able to make the videos that I make here. 4 videos this week, which takes quite a lot of organising, quite a lot of preparation and all of that. So my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon or via occasional donations via PayPal. Links for both of those in the video description below if you would like to join them. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.